Okay, we're in the bottom of Hey Amud Aleph, bottom of 5a. We are still in our discussion on arrogance versus humility. And the Gemara now is going to make a statement that really brings to home some of the things we were talking about before. Here is the most explicit reference to what we were talking about in terms of a person's confidence, or an arrogant person whose confidence comes from their own personal accomplishments and how shaky their confidence is. This is Gemara is going to make this statement quite clearly here. And there's going to be one part of the statement that I'm going to ask for your help. I've tried to put some thought into what it means, and I'm not sure. So let's see. So right over here, and you can see my pointer. Amar Rabbi Alexandri. Rabbi Alexandri says, Kol Adam, any person, sheyesh bo gasos haruach, who has arrogance, afilu ruach kameya, even the softest wind, by chartai, I'm not sure exactly the direct translation, but something like it throws him off. He can't handle it. So you can see Rashi's words here. Per anuyes kala, the smallest distress. Tairaftai makes him lose his mind. Mabadatai, he loses himself, throws him off. He's completely thrown off his axles when the smallest thing doesn't go the way he wants it to. So this is really kind of like what we were talking about. The person who's arrogant, specifically, ironically, the one who's arrogant, whose confidence comes from his amazing sense of self, and the small thing doesn't go the way he wants to, and now he's thrown off, he can't deal with it, what do I do? But a person who's got humility, and his confidence comes from the fact that Hashem put him here. It doesn't matter what happens. Hashem put me here. This is where I'm supposed to be. And therefore, he doesn't get thrown off so easily. And here, he brings a verse to back up this idea. Shenemar, as the verse reads, Varashoyim kiyam nigrash. And the wicked wave like the ocean. So let's see what this verse is. It's in Isaiah 57:20. And as Rashi points out, earlier in the same chapter, it's talking about those who are humble. Some of the psukim, some of the verses that the Gemara quoted earlier talking about humility come from this chapter in Isaiah 57. And then it concludes, this chapter concludes, but the wicked, Varashayim, ki yam nigrish, like troubled seas, ki hashket la yuchal, which cannot rest. V'yigarshu memo of refesh v'kit, whose waters toss up myrrh and mud. So in other words, the wicked here, in the context of this chapter, is talking about those who are the opposite of the righteous described earlier in the chapter. The righteous described earlier in the chapter is specifically those who are humble, and therefore the wicked in this context is referring to those who are arrogant. And thus the verse refers to the wicked who are like troubled waters that are constantly moving and constantly waving. They can't be settled. So says the Gemara. So before we get to the next line of the Gemara, essentially the Gemara is saying is that in the same way the ocean cannot settle, wind comes and moves it. So likewise, this person who's arrogant, or in the way we're understanding it, his sense of confidence, his sense of dignity comes from all of his amazing accomplishments or self-perceived accomplishments, and he's never settled. He's caught the smallest thing, throws him off his axles, as Rashi said it, and a little wind makes him wave here, and he can't find his place. Doesn't have true confidence. He's constantly in doubt.
So is this verse in Isaiah, is it trying to parallel the definition of arrogance, wickedness?
Okay, that's a good question. Probably so. But the way Rashi seems to put it is that in this context, the wicked are those who are not humble, because previously he's talking about the virtue of humility in the same chapter. And then it says, but the wicked, meaning in the context of this, is those who are not humble. But you're probably right too, in that the verse is referring to those who are not humble as wicked. So that itself is something that's interesting. Although the Gemara doesn't make that reference specifically. Sorry?
Yes, wicked is more broader than arrogance. Arrogance includes wickedness.
Right.
But not necessarily the other way around.
Right. Which is why Rashi makes the comment and saying that in this context, considering that the earlier in the chapter is talking about humility, the wicked here are those who are lacking that humility. That's why Rashi makes that comment here. Okay, so now the Gemara gets into the specifics of the ocean. I was actually reading the other day in a teaching in Chassidus in a different context about oceans and waves, and talking about how ocean is symbolic of that whose movement is not its own. His movement must rely on those outside of them, like the wind. The wind has to move the water. The water itself is stagnant. It's the wind that moves it. And it's talking about another, unrelated to this, a different spiritual entity that requires outside movement to get it moving. But I guess it's kind of a similar thing. He's constantly dependent on the outside. And therefore, if it goes the wrong direction, he's thrown off his axles. Anyway, so let's see specifically how the Gemara compares this person who's arrogant to water. And this is something that I'll translate the Gemara as is, but I'm going to open the floor to interpretation because I'm not 100% sure how we can, what the Gemara really means to say here. So let's see. The Gemara says, "Ma yam," just like an ocean, which is moved by the which waves moved by the wind. Sheyesh by kama reviyos, it has many portions of water. Reviyos is a certain measure of water, which is very small. It's a quarter of a lug. It's maybe a cup or something. It's not a lot. So the ocean obviously has many such measures of water. Ruach kamea echartei, and the slightest wind starts to make waves. Adam, a person, she'ein boy el reviyos achas, which only has one reviyos of blood, one reviyos of liquid, one measure of liquid in his body. Now, the person has much more blood than that, but as Rashi explains, there's a certain measure that's for halachic purposes as to how much blood causes certain levels of impurity, and what's required is the amount of blood necessary for a person to live, that minimum amount, and the minimum amount is this reviyos, this measure of blood. All to say that the person's liquid is much less than the liquid of the ocean. And if the ocean with all of its liquid is still moved by the slightest wind, then the person who has much less liquid, alachas kam v'kama, how much more so that he is thrown off by a little bit of wind. Okay. So that's literally what the Gemara says. Now, I'm opening the floor to trying to understand what's the Gemara adding here. I mean, it seemed okay. It seemed self-understood without the statement.
Is there supposed to be some sort of arrogance to the water?
That's what I'm thinking of. So what's going on here? Exactly. Like
what's with the water that?
Exactly. The point is made. You know, oceans move around by wind, and this person lacks arrogance, and therefore, like Rashi said, the smallest trouble throws him off his axle. He loses himself completely when the smallest trouble comes to him because he doesn't have real confidence. He has arrogance, right? His confidence.
But it's also
yeah.
It also says that arrogance and anger makes your blood boil.
Yeah. Oh, there's a connection there.
That's a very well-known saying.
So maybe that's what this is then. Let's think of that.
It gets your blood stirring.
Right. So maybe then water is symbolic of that which should cool you down, the opposite of arrogance. And you don't have that much to hold you back. So you can easily get riled up. Whereas like the ocean, as it were, has a lot more water, has much more to keep it calm. Whereas your blood boils very quickly, and therefore certainly you'll get thrown off if you're arrogant. Maybe, because you don't have that much. Yeah, that could be.
There's also in relation.
Yeah.
There's also in relation to Paro and how he deified the water and himself with water, with the Nile. The Nile was proclaimed to be like the deity, so to speak.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
So it has a certain power.
Yeah. Water being like the source of life and the most easiest things to deify, like they did in Egypt, or in modern terms, like the Alter Rebbe writes in chapter 1 of Tanya, that water symbolizes lust and pleasure, because all of pleasures are derived from water. Water makes everything grow. And I guess that would be connected also to Alan's point that it's the blood that gets worked up in these pleasures. Interesting. Thank you. Okay, that's very good. That we certainly have some direction. Put some more thought into that and see if we can come with something that puts all this together and gives us a nice teaching. Okay. Now the Gemara shifts a little bit in the gear still on the subject of arrogance versus humility, but a different angle, and somewhat in the opposite direction, or actually directing the opposite direction as till now. Because till now we've been deriding arrogance, and now the Gemara is going to tell us that a certain amount of arrogance is appropriate. So let's see. Amar Rab Chiya bar Ashi. Rab Chiya bar Ashi says, you see my pointer, it's here. Amar Rav, the name of Rav. Talmud Chacham, a scholar, Sarech Shiyehei, must have Echad Mishmoina B'Shminis, must have 1/8 of an eighth, or 16th, right? 1/8 of arrogance. Got to have at least that. Tiny bit amount of arrogance. What for? So Rashi explains, because this is the only way that people will listen to a scholar. The person is going to be a leader of a community and has no sense of, quote unquote, tiny bit of arrogance that will allow him to assert himself. No one's going to listen to guys. He's going to be a pushover, and he won't be able to lead his community. So he has to have 1/8 of an eighth, 1/16, one tiny measure of arrogance, of pride, so that he can make his point and lead his community, and people will actually respect him. And Amr Rav Huna Blei Rav Yeshua, and Rabbi Shihuna, son of Rabbi Yeshua, said, "Uma'atrele," that tiny little bit of arrogance crowns him, kisasa l'shibulta, like the hairs on top of the kernel, on top of the wheat grain. We mentioned earlier that the arrogant one is like those wheat, those little hairs on the top of the wheat that fall off. And here he's using it in the positive sense, that if there's a positive arrogance, we'll elaborate in a moment what the virtue of this is, based on what we just said from Rashi. It's about making sure you can communicate to your community and making sure that you can assert yourself with that little bit. So that, says Rabbi Huna, is like the crown, invoking the same metaphor of the hair on top of the kernel. And Amar Rava says, Beshamta b'isbei, a scholar who has too much, who's full of arrogance, should be excommunicated. Ubeshamta d'lesbei, and a scholar who has zero arrogance should also be excommunicated. So either way, it's no good. The person is just a doormat, and he doesn't take himself seriously, doesn't take his position seriously, doesn't take his leadership role seriously, doesn't have any sense of pride in what he is doing to lead his community, can't be a leader. And likewise, the guy who's completely arrogant, totally full of himself, very impressed with himself, he also can't be a leader. So either way, it's no good. So there's got to be what the Gemara calls 1/8 of an eighth, one tiny little measure of arrogance, so that the scholar has some sort of leadership quality. So this is the first view of the Gemara here. But Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Lo minei v'lo miktsaseh, not even tiniest bit of arrogance, nothing, zero. Not of it, and not even of its extremities. That's literally the translation. Lo minei, not of it. V'lo miktsaseh, not even a tiny bit, not even the extremities. Why? Mizupter diksivbe, is it nothing to you that which the verse says? We quoted this verse earlier. Toyevas Hashem kol goy v'leiv. It's abhorrent to God, all those who are arrogant. You want to risk that even with 1/8 of an eighth? Nothing. No arrogance at all. Okay, so these are the two views of the Gemara here. It's quite remarkable. So I want to share with you. The Rebbe spoke about this Gemara, this 1/8 of an eighth, quite a bit actually. I want to share with you one talk from the Rebbe on this subject. This comes from Yud Kislev, 19th of Kislev, which of course is a celebration day in Chabad. A talk the Rebbe gave 19th of Kislev in the year Tavshin Yud Gimel. That would be 1953. So it's only 3 years after the Rebbe began his leadership as the Rebbe. And the Rebbe is still in the stages of educating his own followers into this idea of shlichus, this idea of going out there and sharing Torah and sharing Chassidus with the world. Very novel concept. And Rebbe had to educate even his own community to appreciate the value of that. So the Rebbe is pushing very strongly on this idea of going out there and teaching Chassidus to the world out there. So it says there like this. With respect to the idea of spreading the teachings of Chassidus, there are those who argue, who am I? This is the person saying why he is not going out there and teaching Chassidus. This idea, not appropriate for people like me. They're not completely reneging on their responsibilities. And they're ready to get involved in spreading Torah. They're only going to teach the revealed exoteric element of Torah, the Jewish law, Chumash, Gemara, and so on. But the inner dimension of Torah, the mystical dimension of Torah, in which it talks about the 10 Sefirot, and even the loftier spiritual, mystical levels, they're afraid to approach that and to start teaching deep mystical concepts. Why? They're worried that if they teach Chassidus, they're going to misrepresent these subtle mystical things, and they'll end up giving a very corporeal and materialistic vision of it, when in reality it's this very lofty mystical concepts that have no relation to our physical imagery. And therefore, because of the subtlety of the subject, he's afraid to approach it in teaching it. He doesn't want to cut the vineyard, as it were. He doesn't want to ruin the beauty of Chassidus, and therefore he doesn't want to teach it to the world around. And therefore, with respect to this request that they go teach Chassidus to the world out there, now we start to see their virtues of being humble. Because they say, there are others who are better at teaching these lofty spiritual ideas. I'm not going to do it. So this is the claim that some people are telling the Rebbe, apparently, that they don't want to teach Chassidus because it's not for them. You have people who have good explanation, they're good at teaching Chassidus, they'll do that. I'm going to I'll teach halacha, I'll teach Jewish law, I'll teach basic things, but I don't want to teach Chassidus, I'm too afraid of it. And they all of a sudden become humble and doubting their capacity to properly communicate Chassidic concepts. And in response, says that Bagdama, first of all, by way of introduction, the truth is, this is false humility. What's the proof that it's false humility? When it comes to other matters, inyanim gashmiyim, material matters, if they aren't honored with these material honors, and you tell them, oh, this accomplishment, not for you. That business, not for you. They'll get offended by it. So if they're told that they're incapable of accomplishing something in the realm of material accomplishments, all of a sudden they're not humble. Here they say, no, I can do it. But only when it comes to the secrets and mystical parts of Torah, now all of a sudden they become humble. False humility, says the Rebbe. If you're consistently always humble, okay, I would understand. But this guy is, many people, I suppose Rebbe speaking to certain people who made this claim to him, Rebbe understands that they're not humble in all of their aspects of life, that all of a sudden when they're told that they need to teach Chassidus to the world around them, now all of a sudden they become all humble. So that's number one, it's false humility. Now, the Gemara, even though the Gemara says, not our Gemara, but elsewhere, that even someone who's humble for the wrong reasons, is still good. It's actually a very great thing. Meaning to say, there's a virtue in humility, however it comes about. And therefore, the person reasons, the same thing is true of my case. Even if the result of my humility is going to be the lack of teaching Chassidus to the world outside, which is certainly not good, because it's better if the world would be learning, if the world was taught. But nonetheless, as the Gemara said, even humility that's done for the wrong reason is virtuous. So this person's claiming that my humility, even if it's false humility, is still virtuous. You're right that I am humble, that I'm not humble when it comes to other accomplishments, but don't take away from the virtue of my humility here in saying that I'm not worthy of teaching Chassidus. There's still virtue to humility, even if it's false. But the Rebbe says, and this is great. The truth is, this quote unquote humility is actually adding to his arrogance. Because he looks at himself and says, look at me, I even have the virtue of humility. Leplaini, this is the person speaking to himself. Leplaini, to the other guy, the other guy indeed knows lots of Chassidus, and he's teaching Chassidus. But on the other hand, because I am not teaching Chassidus, I even have humility. But the Gemara says how great humility is. So look at me, I'm great and humble. So Rebbe says not only is it false humility, because in other areas you're very willing to assert yourself, and all of a sudden when it comes to your responsibility to teach others, now you become humble. So it's false humility, number one. Number two, that humility isn't even real humility because you're just proud of yourself, of your humility. So that humility just feeds further into your own arrogance.
Couldn't it be the type of humility such as Moshe Rabbeinu, when he just perhaps felt that he wasn't up to the task?
But did you mean like when Moshe
Maybe
Rabbeinu?
some of the yeshiva students, perhaps they felt they weren't up to the task.
That's right. So it's actually funny. Robert Burke emailed me yesterday about Moshe Rabbeinu, and there's a constant. And he's right. There's a constant dialogue between Moshe and Hashem in regard to Moshe's humility, and it seems like he keeps going back and forth between humility of I can't do this to what God's expecting of him, the humility to say I'm asking you to do it, so you do it anyway. That kind of thing. That seems to be the dialogue. So yeah, it's interesting, and that's kind of what these students are arguing.
That's a very beautiful concept that we just mentioned by my colleague, I must tell you. And Rabbi, I found this very remarkable because in Moshe Rabbeinu, one can see that he was generally humble, and it didn't really come from a sense of pride. And it just shows you the difference. It's very interesting. Shakespeare says, with regard to Julius Caesar, and he was the most proud of all when they told him he was humble. So the opposite between Moshe Rabbeinu and Julius Caesar here in the context. But what you said is so remarkable because so often people feign, they pretend, they feign a lack of desire. It's a lack of desire very often. And a lack of wanting to strengthen their knowledge in a certain area, rather than ensure that they work on something that is more difficult. It's like anyone who has to practice to do much more in order to be able to do it, but he has the talent already, but he doesn't want to do it.
So it's fear rather than anxiety, than humility.
Exactly. Yeah. But such an important concept, and I'm so grateful. What a beautiful concept was mentioned also with regard to the arrogance and wickedness and so on. That was a beautiful, it's very beautiful when we have sometimes. It's like your namesake, Karo. Coming from the way that the Shulchan Aruch was created and put together in a beautiful way. So your namesake from a long time ago, it just is a very beautiful. Comes across with your comments. So that's really very, very, very beautiful.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you.
So
thank you.
Thank you. So now that Rebbe gets to our Gemara.
Beautiful how much we learn, Rabbi, from even the Chavad we have together and what has been developed around you in the most wonderful way because you inspire us so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So now that Rebbe gets to actually our Gemara. Now, Gufa Shel Inyan, in response to the actual claim of the person's unworthiness to teach Chassidus. So says the Rebbe, when it comes to the question of the responsibility we have to teach and share with others, including Chassidus, one must remember, one must know, one should not take into consideration his own personal status. Am I worthy of it or am I not worthy of it? That is all the Yetzer Hara. It's the Yetzer Hara, it's the evil inclination trying to talk you out of your responsibility by saying, oh, I'm not worthy, and introducing this false piety and this false humility. Ignore that discussion. Your worthiness is not part of the equation when it comes to your responsibility to teach. One must behave in such a manner. This is a verse that one of the prophets say, and it says about the prophet that he raised up his heart in the service of Hashem. He raised up his heart, this word of raising up, a certain sense of pride and confidence. And here the Rebbe quotes our Gemara, like our sages say, Talmud Chacham, a sage, he has to have 1/8 of an eighth of gaiva, 1/8 of an eighth of arrogance, in order so that he can teach. Just one second, sorry. So as the Gemara says here that a person has to have 1/8 of an eighth, and if you saw from the Rashi that the reason why the Talmud, the sage, has to have 1/8 of an eighth of arrogance, he has to have a little bit, it's that he can teach and lead. So likewise here, when a person is given the responsibility and the task to teach Chassidus, the question of his worthiness or not worthiness, this quote unquote humble discussion, out the window. He must remember his responsibility and raise up his heart, as the verse says, in serving Hashem. And here,
How do you rate?
Sorry.
How do you rate Shammai? Because here's a guy who is willing to teach if you knew your stuff. But when you don't know your stuff and you come over like this person who came to him and said, teach me Chassidus while I'm standing on one leg.
And he said, I can't do it.
Never mind, he hit him with a stick.
Yeah. So the truth is that there's a deep explanation that Rebbe gives on Shammai's approach. But in that sense, maybe that's why in exile, we have to follow the Hillel approach. We have to follow the Hillel approach nowadays. Maybe that's why the halacha is like Hillel.
That's right.
So now the Rebbe gets to something interesting. It's a bit Kabbalistic, but I find it interesting nonetheless. And we'll conclude with this. And the Rebbe quoting now a teaching from the Alter Rebbe, from the first Rebbe, and explaining why it's 1/8 of an eighth, why a 16th. So it says like this. There is a teaching, a discourse from the Alter Rebbe, from the first Chabad Rebbe, Mishnas Tovkuf Ayin, from the year Tovkuf Ayin, which would be 1720, 1710, some would think. I'm not sure translating into English. Dibar Masal Inyan Shminish Mishminis. And the subject matter is this Gemara, the 1/8 of an eighth. And this discourse has Hanochas Harav Pinchas, a chassid Pinchas Eitzis. There were different people who transcribed the Alter Rebbe's teachings. And one of them was a chassid named Pinchas Reizis, famous chassid. Asher Chak Machad Mor Siper, that the previous Rebbe said, that Pinchas, when he would transcribe the teachings of the Alter Rebbe, he was very precise in the language. Okay. And this is the language of the Alter Rebbe. So we're reading now, the Rebbe is quoting now a text from the first Rebbe in explaining this idea of an 1/8 of an eighth. So it says like this, quote, Inyan Shminish Bishminis, the idea of the 1/8 of an eighth, the 16th of arrogance, that the scholar must have in order to raise up his heart so that he can teach. Ki Moshe Amar, Moshe says, V'anachnu ma, who are we? Humility. But Akin b'Yehoshaphat, but when it comes to the prophet Yehoshaphat, Ksiv, the verse reads, this is the verse we quoted earlier, Vayigba liba b'darchei Hashem, he raised up his heart in the service of God. The David Ksiv of King David, it says, V'adabra b'edeisecha, and I will speak in your words, talking to you, God, Neged Melachim, in the face of kings. So he also got the sense of confidence. He's willing to speak Torah even in the face of great kings. So where's the balance here? So explains the Alter Rebbe. The matter is, in one's mind, and in his wisdom, there has to be humility to the nth degree. Intellectually speaking, in his mind, in his perception of the world, absolute humility. And this is the idea of wisdom, which Kabbalistically is associated with water, and water is associated with humility, because water by nature goes to the lowest point. However, Afal became nonetheless, even though intellectually, even though in his wisdom, in his mind, in his perception of the world, he's absolutely humble, doesn't see himself as anything more valuable than anybody else. But nonetheless, Afal became. In his heart, there's got to be pride. And there's the distinction here. In his mind, humility. In his heart, confidence and pride. And that's why it says Talmud Chacham, right? The scholar is referred to as Chacham. We'll get to that in a minute. So in his mind, his perception, this is what he says here, which is perhaps what this means is that in his perception of the world, the way he understands the world, the way he sees the world around him, so he reasons very simply, everything I have is a gift from God. And if everything I have is a gift from God, there's no reason for me to be any greater than anybody else. But in his passions, in his heart, full of confidence, full of pride. The Pasuk says he raised up his heart in the service of God. So even as his mind is humble, his perception of the world says, I'm not greater than anybody else. In his heart, in terms of his passion and his emotion, he's not meek. He's full of confidence, he's full of pride, and he's ready to do what he has to get done. Believe, and the heart is miskan yeshod ha'esh, is associated with the element of fire in Kabbalah, which raises up. So the wisdom is associated with water, which goes down, humility, and the heart is associated with fire. Emotions are associated with fire, passion, and that goes up. And therefore the verse which describes confidence and raising up is with respect to the heart. He raised up his heart in the service of Hashem. Okay, we'll skip the parentheses. How is it possible that his heart can be able to be elevated and exalted? How is it possible that simultaneously, sorry, hold on a second. Sorry. So, how is it possible that simultaneously in his heart he's full of confidence and passion and he's raised up heart, ready to do what he has to, while simultaneously in his mind he retains extreme humility? How is this possible? And that's where the eighth of the arrogance is. The eighth of arrogance is in his mind. Even in his perception of the world, where he has complete humility and understands that anybody else, he's not greater than anybody else. Nonetheless, there's one little part of him that says, I am worthy. A tiny little bit in his mind. And that little bit in his mind allows him to have the confidence in his heart. Now, why eighth of an eighth? So now here's for the mathematicians. In Kabbalah, there are 32 pathways of wisdom. Now, within wisdom, there are two elements. In Kabbalah, Yesh Lamed Beis Nesivos the Abba. There are 32 pathways of the father. The Lamed Beis the Emran, 32 pathways of the mother. So without getting too deep here, the basic idea is that in the mind there are two elements. There's the mind's capacity for creativity and the mind's capacity for innovation, for analysis, and that's Chachma versus Bina. And each of them have 32. The bottom line is Nisparim is Samach Dalet, or a total of 64. Now Shmini Shibishminis, what an eighth of an eighth? Hu Chelek HaKatan V'Yoser is the smallest amount. Hainu Chelek Samach Dalet, that is 1 part of 64. How does that work out? How does that work out? What's the number?
That's the eighth of the eighth is 164, I think, right?
Is that right? No,
Yeah,
so it's not a 16th. It's an 8th.
No, it's a 64th. It's a 64th.
It's a 64th. There you go. I said a 16th when I translated the Gemara, but that's incorrect. It's an 8th of an 8th. So you take an 8th and then you break that down into 8 too. Right?
Yes.
So that's 1/64th of the whole, because you have to do 8 times 8 and then one portion of that. So it's 64. There you go. So there's the math. Because there are 64 pathways Kabbalistically in the mind, so you have to have one pathway of some arrogance, of some self-confidence, and that will allow the heart to be passionate and confident in getting what is done. This is the 8th of the 8th. That there has to remain even in his mind, even one tiny amount. That is 1/64th. So that through this, that his heart can be raised up in passionate service of Hashem. So there you have this little kind of Kabbalistic teaching. And the sum total of it is two things. Number one, the Rebbe is echoing the words of Rashi in that this 8th of arrogance is only for the sake of being able to teach others. So that you don't renege on your responsibility to teach others and say, oh, I'm too humble, I can't do this. A little bit of arrogance you need, a little bit of pride you need, so that you can say, I need to lead the community, I need to share, I need to teach each person in whatever leadership capacity they are, in their families, in their communities, in their friends, whatever it is. Number one. Number two is this interesting idea of separating humility that's in the mind and confidence that's in the heart. When we're talking about perceiving our world, the perception of our world, absolute humility. Anybody else could do just as good as a job of me, if not better. But in my in my passion, in my drive, I'm full of confidence, ready to get whatever I have to get done. And in order for that confidence to go, there's got to be one pathway in the mind that says I'm worthy. One pathway in the mind that says you can do this. And that can infuse me with the passion and confidence I need to get the job done. So let's see what. Yes. Yeah, Robert Burke comments that Rabbi Josh Gordon was that kind of person. Humble confidence. Absolutely. He's definitely that kind of person.
Very beautiful.
Okay,
Thank you very much. That was a great.
Thank you.
All the best to you. Have a great day, everyone. God bless you all.
Wonderful day, everybody.
Everybody,
Have a great day,
good
everybody.
day. Good day, Judge.
God bless you. All the best.
All the best.
God bless you all too.
All right, have a good day.
To Alan, Robert.